Hi, my name's Rick Langer, and I'm your host for this iFlip about the failed models of the integration of faith and learning. A lot of times we learn interesting things from looking at something that's not quite right. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the integration of faith and learning. I've thought about myself and how I do it. I read it in books and I think about it, and I've discovered at least a half a dozen different ways in which I think we do it in ways that are unproductive, counterproductive, sometimes just plain wrong. And I would encourage anyone, if you see yourself in any of these models, not to feel too bad, because most of these things I have noticed because I've noticed myself doing them. But let me highlight some of these models as a bit of a cautionary tale, something to think about avoiding as you're doing the integration of faith and learning. So the first model I would like to talk about is what I call hermit crab integration. Now, the interesting thing about a hermit crab is that the hermit crab doesn't make his own shell. Hermit crab, if you ever see him in a shell, you know the only thing you know about the shell, it could look like anything. You just know he didn't make it. He adopted it from someone else and he crammed it full of his own stuff. And I would argue Christians have a knack of doing that with artifacts that have been made by the secular world. And that doesn't make these things necessarily wrong. They simply aren't uniquely Christian. And we have a way of not thinking about the shell Christianly, but rather adopting it lock, stock, and barrel and just sticking it full of Christian stuff. An interesting example of hermit crab integration might be found in dating services that are available on the internet. So the famous pioneer of this was eHarmony.com, and it wasn't very long later when you got ChristianMingle.com coming along in its wake. And you can almost see exactly what happened. The existing shell of internet dating as formed by eHarmony.com was adopted by Christians, packed full of Christian content and called Christian Mingle. But the idea, everything that's happening in that context, is an adopted shell. And one wonders if they have thought carefully about Christian implications for internet dating. Is this the kind of thing that we would want to endorse or encourage? And I don't even know. I haven't really thought that closely about these issues. I'm just concerned that we adopt them uncritically. And when we do that, we're simply practicing what we might call a hermit crab integration, where we take all of our Christian content and stick it into a pre-existing shell of secular origins. In the case of Christian Mingle and eHarmony, it may not be a big deal, but you might think at a grander scale about that same notion taking place with an idea like a human institution of slavery. And so you could see in the antebellum South, there would be manuals written how to be a good Christian slave owner. And they would take principles from Scripture and apply it to the context of how a master should or shouldn't beat his slave, or how he should or shouldn't divide the children of slaves, and all of those sorts of notions without ever questioning the institution of slavery itself. And notice what's happening is you're taking a shell of a human institution, in this case of slavery, packing it full of a Christian way to do it without ever stopping to thinking, should you do it at all? Now, we've moved beyond that discussion with slavery, at least in the context of American culture. But I would argue you could ask similar questions about things like democracy, things like capitalism, and in these cases, probably things that we would actually acknowledge are good, but you might stop and think, how much of these notions have I taken uncritically from the way they're presented in the world? Capitalism may have good things in it, but is American capitalism, as we currently practice it, really a good thing? Should I just pack it full of Christian content, or should I be more critical of its shape and of its structure? So hermit crab integration is one thing that I think we want to avoid doing. A second thing that is good to avoid is what I will call Christmas tree integration. And Christmas tree integration actually happens a lot in the context of the Christian world, because many of us have done our academic studies in a secular context where no one is concerned with integrating faith and learning. And then we come to a Christian university to teach, and we're told we must integrate faith and learning. But all of our material has been given to us. We're teaching a Sociology 100 class, and the way we've taught that before has been in a secular context. And we go, oh no, what do we do? How do I make this work in my new Christian context? So you take the pre-existing syllabus that you already had from teaching it at some other university and just say, how can I find Bible verses that somehow map onto the same concepts that were already in my syllabus? And oftentimes you can see a Christmas tree integration process marked by a whole bunch of Bible verses in parentheses. And if you look up the Bible verse and look at the concept, you realize the only thing that's really in common is 2 or 3 interesting words, but the ideas themselves really have almost nothing to do with each other. And what someone's done is, in effect, to hang a Christian Bible bauble on top of the existing tree of secular thought that they had embodied in this particular syllabus. And please note when I'm saying this, I'm not saying everything in that secular context is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we almost do a deceptive thing when we baptize all of that as being Christian. That's really the unique danger of Christmas tree integration, is we take something that probably has a lot of truth in it, and we hang enough Christian baubles on it, Bible verses on it, to make a person think this is all deeply Christian truth. And therefore we become uncritical and we accept it lock, stock, and barrel, where it might be far more wiser to be testing every teaching, so to speak, and not assuming that simply because you can hang a Bible verse on it, that it must be deeply Christian. A third form of integration that we practice a lot is what I might call Tebow integration. Most of you are probably familiar with Tim Tebow, athlete who came to the NFL and had a lot of success, at least for a short period of time. But at every interview, before he said anything else, he'd always say, "I'd like to thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ." And then he'd go on with a whole discussion about the blitz packages that he was facing and how they were able to defeat those by having a good zone running scheme. And off it goes into a conversation about football that is no different than would be in any other context. And you notice what's happened is you've just dropped in a little Christian moment. And it seems not so much like integration as interruption. In fact, that was one of the things that many people complained about Tim Tebow's interviews, is that it always seemed like the Christian stuff is thrown in out of context and as an interruption. And one of the dangers of doing that is you can see this happen in a academic university setting. If you're always throwing in a Bible verse devotional that's in no way connected to the content of your class, simply sharing a word of testimony, and again, in no way connected to the content. These things kind of create an image that the Bible is concerned with a batch of things over here. The rest of your academic studies are concerned with a batch of other things over here. They're compartmentally separate. And so if you ever bring the two together, they won't look like they belong with each other. And I'd like to point out that biblically, the God of creation is the God of redemption. Jesus really belongs in both places. Yes, he's the God of the cross, but he's also the God of the created order. He, in some sense, should be every bit as at home in the context of all the ongoing roles of human culture, creation, and life, as he is in the context of church and our thoughts of the next world, the world to come. These things are places where Jesus always belongs. And whenever we make him seem like an interruption, we're sending, in some sense, the message that Jesus doesn't really belong in this context. And I don't think that's a message that we really want to send. Sometimes when we do the integration of faith and learning, we do something that I actually call tribal integration or Balkan integration, which is probably just to say it isn't really integration. If you think of the Balkans, they are famously divided from one another. If you think of a tribe, the interesting thing about different tribes is that they don't share some common chief. The highest court of appeal is their own chief, so there's no overarching place that you can go. The discourse, so to speak, is confined within the community. And this is a notion that is very common. In fact, it's almost a distinctive feature of postmodernism. And that is that the community of discourse, in effect, sets its own rules, determines its own language game, standards of truth, guidance for inquiry, all these things are self-contained within the discipline. And that creates a context in which disciplines can't really talk to themselves or talk between each other. They can only talk to themselves. And in the context of Christianity, I think this becomes deeply problematic because of our commitment to the overarching person of Christ and saying everything ultimately attaches back to him. And that makes it very difficult to have those attachments coming from things that have been constructed so as to actually be contradictory with one another. There's no particular effort to harmonize or bring the discourse together. And I think a Christian should be committed to the notion that Jesus is indeed Lord of all, and there ought to be ways in which that discipline echoes back to the person of Jesus Christ, and hopefully should echo back harmoniously with what you're hearing from other disciplines. And so you don't want to allow your discourses to be tribalized. They will be distinctive. They will speak in their own idiom. They will have their own sort of structure, but that needs to ultimately be complementary and finally united into the context of the person of Christ himself. So I would push back against notions of integration that allow discourses to be tribalized and compartmentalized from one another. So hopefully identifying some of these challenges, some of these things that are kind of failed models of integration just help us to think more clearly about what we do want to do and caution us against some things that we might want to avoid doing as we try and practice the integration of faith and learning in the classroom. Thanks for joining us for this iFlip.